Hello, my friends. I hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to jump into a book or a little pamphlet that I've been reading. I figured, listen, my ultimate aim is to try to encourage and inspire you to think very deeply about your faith, think about what you believe, why you believe, participate in all sorts of practices of spiritual formation and growth. And one of the things that just popped in my mind is I'm often reading something throughout the week, and why not share it with you and maybe even just read through it with you, so maybe we can join together in this journey and this quest to learn more about Jesus. So today I'm going to share what I'm reading. I'm reading an incredible book. It's more of a pamphlet than it is anything else, but it's a writing by David Clarkson. He was a 17th century Puritan preacher, and the Puritan writings are so incredible because they hit you at the center of your heart, and it really causes you to think about things that you perhaps would never think about. And that's surely the case with this particular writing. It's entitled "Soul Idolatry Excludes Men Out of Heaven," and it is written to give a perspective on how easy it is to commit idolatry. And so today we're going to look at a few things. We're going to look at first the twofold worship that he mentions, and then we're going to look at the two sorts of idolatry, and then we're going to look at 13 acts of soul worship that we should be aware of and how we should go about aiming that worship towards God. So the passage that he's actually drawing from as he just goes through this entire concept is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 5, where he says, Paul wrote here in this passage, "For this you know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ." And so obviously the underlying idea is the idolater. Like an idolater is one who is obviously a whoremonger, unclean, covetous. These are things that they participate in. But obviously this is much deeper than just simply bowing down before something. Like there's some things going on in the heart or internally that we have to watch out for. And that's the aim. That is the premise and the thesis of this entire writing. It's a powerful, powerful writing, and I want to get right into it so that we don't waste any time. So here is what he describes as the twofold worship. And he argues that there's a twofold worship due only to God, internal and external. So these are the two forms or the twofold worships that one might participate in. That is that which is external and then that which is internal. Now, we're pretty familiar with what is external. He describes external worship as that which consists in acts and gestures of the body. When a man bows to or prostrates himself before a thing, this is the worship of the body. And when these gestures of bowing, prostration are used not out of a civil, but a religious respect, with an intention to testify divine honor, then it is worship due only to God. So, we have seen where people have knelt before men, and we've seen how people have, shown signs of respect. That's not necessarily what he's talking about here. He is saying that there's a distinction in an external act of worship that is given only to God, only in worship of God, and it's due only to God. So there are ways in which we externally worship God, and in today's world that might be by clapping our hands or raising our hands to the Lord, or opening our mouth to say kind things and reverent things about God. But what he is clear to say is that sort of thing should be reserved only for God. And so we cannot worship something else in the same way that we would worship God, with those same gestures, those same movements or external expressions. So we're pretty familiar with that. We have seen in the Bible where God told Israel not to bow before any gods. These are sort of things that happen. But what we're going to see is that what happens externally is often an expression of what has already or what also happens internally. And this is where it gets interesting, because he says internal folds of worship consist in the acts of the soul and actions answerable thereto, when the mind is most taken up with an object and the heart and affections most set upon it, This, he says, is soul worship. It's when your mind and your heart and your affections are set upon a thing. That is soul worship. And this is due only to God, he says. For he being the chief good and the last end of intelligent creatures, it is due proper to him alone to be most minded, most affected. It is the honor due only to the Lord to have the first, the highest place, both in our minds and in our hearts and in our endeavors. Now, this is where this begins to push against the cultural norm of America and Western thinking, because we have become so busy and so obsessed with other things, whether it's fame or, fashion or material goods or, just progression in our careers. What he's saying here is there's only one person that is deserving of our highest place in both our mind, in our heart, in our endeavors, in our affection, and that person is God himself. And we're going to see here that, because if you haven't already, it would be good to go and look up a video by Tim Keller. This is actually where I got the recommendation. Tim Keller preached a sermon somewhere talking about the very dangers of committing soul idolatry. And he referenced this book as the resource or the source for his actual sermon. But what we find, if we were to conceptualize this idea of soul idolatry, internal idolatry, if you will, how those things are depicted, or that rather, internal worship is depicted by what takes up the most of our mind, our thoughts, our heart, our desires, our endeavors, our actions, right? It would be very, very rare to find that God is at that place where he deserves to be in this world, because we're just so busy. We're always on the move. We're always doing something. And so with this in mind, what he does is he gives us 13 acts of soul worship. Okay? Now, before he gets there, he wants us to understand that there are two sorts of idolatry. Okay? There is open outward idolatry, which is when men, out of a religious respect, bow to or prostrate themselves before anything besides God. This is the idolatry of the heathens, where people often bow before statues or men or, creatures or created things. That's open outward idolatry. But then he says there is what he calls secret and soul idolatry, when the mind and the heart is set upon anything more than God. When anything is more valued, more intended, anything more trusted, more loved, or our endeavors more for any other thing than God, that is what he calls secret or soul idolatry. Now, just think about that. Just bring that on in. Write down a list of things that you feel like you cannot live without. And you might find that you and I are possible of soul and secret idolatry, okay? He says further, then is that soul worship which is due only to God, and that which he must respect and calls for, given to other things besides him. And this is as true as heinous idolatry as the former, though not so open, discernible, nor so much observed. So what he's saying is we can easily spot the open and outward idolatry, but we have a more difficult time identifying the secret and soul idolatry. So the aim of today's reading, as we read through this, is to identify what could be soul or secret idolatry in our life, and then obviously rid those things from becoming a distraction from worshiping God. All right, so let's look at the 13 things. The first thing is esteem. He says that which we most highly value, we make our God. So whatever is most valuable in our life, it is our God. We can say all we want. I love God. God is the most important thing to me. We can say that all we want. But if God is not the most esteemed thing in our life, then we have an idol there in a place where God should be. He goes on to say, to have a high opinion of ourselves, of our parts and accomplishments, of our relations and enjoyments of riches and honors, or those that are rich and honorable, or anything of like nature, when we have low apprehensions of God, is to advance these things into the place of God, to make them idols and give them that honor and worship which is due only to the divine majesty. What we most esteem, he says, we make our God. If other things are higher esteem, he says you are an idolater. And he references Job chapter 21, verse 14. It's pretty interesting here that he has such a huge grasp. And I'm going to be honest with you. I know you might be saying to yourself, none of this applies to me, but let's just be honest. If we're thinking practically and thinking realistically, we all can imagine how easy it is to esteem something more than we esteem God. All right. Look at what he says, and he references Job 21:14, and this is a Job, of course, response to Zophar. And he says, and yet they say to God, go away, we want no part of you and your ways. So he uses that as a reference point to demonstrate that, yeah, man has a proclivity and a tendency, if you will, to esteem something else higher than God. All right, well, the second thing is mindfulness. That which we are most mindful of, we make our God. He says, in other words, to be most remembered, to be most minded is an act of worship which is proper to God and which he requires as due to himself alone. Other things may be minded, he said, but if they are more minded than God, it is idolatry. The worship of God is given to the creature. So if I was to think through this and think about all the things that my mind I spend my thoughts on all day, the things that I am most mindful of all day, what would it be? Would it be God, or would it be something else? Would it be, let me just give you an example. We think about this all the time. For some people it's health and fitness. For some people it's finances. For some people it's, their professional growth and their educational pursuits. What do I spend my mind on all day? Worrying about, thinking about, celebrating, whatever it is, whatever that thing is God. And I will be the first to admit that it is so easy to spend my mind on things other than God, but yet claim to worship God the most, right? Or to worship God. Well, according to this, he says that's not possible at all. You cannot spend your mind thinking on things more than you think of God and call yourself a worshiper of God. There's an idol in your life that you have to remove. So let's take inventory of that. Let's think about what are your thoughts spent on all day? Well, here's the other thing. The third thing he says is intention. That which we most intend, we make our God. For to be most intended is an act of worship due only to the true God. For he being the chief good must be the last end. So what are we most intentional about, right? What drives us? What is our focus on pursuing and accomplishing every single day? He says that when we make our other things our chief aim or main design, we set them up instead of God and make them idols, when our chief design is to be rich or great or safe or famous or powerful, when our great aim is our own ease or pleasure or credit or profit and advantage, when we aim at or intend anything more or anything so much as the glorifying and enjoying of God, this is soul idolatry. Now, listen, I'm not going to take this pain by myself. All right. Now, if this is not piercing your heart, God bless you. You are a saint of saints. But when you're just reading this, thinking about how driven we are as Americans, how driven we are as individuals in this country, in this world, we sometimes pursue things at a pace and with an intensity that should only be reserved for God. Well, look at what he says. The fourth thing is resolution. What we are most resolved for, we worship as God. Resolvedness, he says, for God above all things is an act of worship which he challenges as due to himself alone. He says to communicate it to other things is to give the worship of God unto them and to so make them gods. When we are fully resolved for other things, for our lusts, humors, outward advantages, and but faintly resolved for God, his ways, his honor, his service, when we resolve absolutely for other things without limitation or restriction, and but conditionally for God upon such and such terms, look at that. Like we say, God, if you do this, I'll do this kind of thing. To serve him as you may serve yourselves too, to seek him as to enjoy your lust with him. He says, when we resolve presently for other things, but refer our resolves for God to the future, let me get enough of the world, of my pleasure, of my lust now. I will think of God hereafter in old age and sickness on a deathbed. These are idolatrous resolutions. God is thrust down. The creatures in your lust advance into the place of God, and that honor which is due only to him you give unto them. This is unquestionable idolatry. You see that? How many times have we heard people say, and maybe we ourselves have said, when I get a certain age, then I'll give my life to Christ. Or when I get this new job, then I'll serve God. Or maybe like even Jacob, Lord, if you bring me back to this land, then I'll worship you. Like he's saying, whenever your resolve is on something else and not towards God, then that itself is idolatry. But here's another one. The fifth thing he says is that love. He says the fifth act of soul worship is love. That which we must love, we worship as our God. Let me say that again, because he says not that which we love the most. He'll get there in some way. But it says that which we must love, we worship as our God. Interesting idea. For love is an act of soul worship. To love and to adore are sometimes both one. This is undoubtedly true if we intend hereby that love which is superlative and transcendent, for to be loved above all things is an act of honor, worship, which the Lord challenges as his due in peculiar, quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And this the Lord Christ comprised all that worship which is required of man. Other things they may be loved, but he will be loved above all other things. He is to be loved transcendently, absolutely, and for himself. All other things are to be loved in him and for him. That's an interesting idea. He looks upon us as not worshiping him at all, not taking him for a God when we love other things more or as much as himself, quoting 1 John or referencing 1 John 2:15. So think about that. Think about the things you love. I'm not talking about, you love a piece of cake, you love ice cream. I'm talking about, you love your spouse, you love your children, you love your job, you love your career, you love your city, you love your alma mater. Well, these things are very important to us, and we often think that it is admirable and it is virtuous to love these things with such a great extent. But what he's saying here, and this is a very touchy thing, but it's very biblical. He's saying here, if we love something more than we love God, we're committing idolatry, and that's not a noble thing, my friends. It is not noble. Tim Keller talked about this in one of his books and even in his sermon, that he had found that people would love their children, which is a very noble thing, but it becomes idolatrous when you love them more than you love God, right? Well, so then what does that look like? It means that you are taking upon yourself a way of loving your children in a way that does not honor God. Because if you really love your children the way you think you do, then you would make sure you love God first and foremost, so that in your love for your children, you can love them in a way that God loves you, right? And the way that you should love your children as a parent. But whenever you are simply just focused on loving your children without any consideration to God himself, then that becomes idolatrous, because your ultimate expression of love is directed towards your children and not to God as it should be. And then that redirects your love in a way that is not healthy for you, the children, or your relationship with God. So it is a matter of really, really getting a handle on what it means to worship God. Because here's a big idea that I'm pulling from what I've already read, is that we can never do anything virtuous if we're not worshiping God the way he says we must worship him. There is no virtue outside of true worship to God. Everything we do in life becomes corrupt and sinful and harmful when we do it outside of worship to the one true God. You see how that works? You see how this is coming together? So the sixth act of soul worship then is trust. That which we most trust, we make our God. For confidence and dependence is an act of worship which the Lord calls for as due only to himself. To trust, he says, in means or instruments. The church disclaims this. And in Psalm chapter 44, verse 6, he quotes, I will not trust in my bow. And Asa is branded for dependence on physicians in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 12. He says to trust in wealth or riches. Job disclaims this. To trust in friends. He says that this is spoken against in Scripture. He's showing us that the very things that we tend to trust the most are the very things that lead us into an idolatrous relationship with some other idol that we need to remove from our life. The seventh act of soul worship is fear. That which we most fear, we worship as God. For fear, he says, is an act of worship, and he shows us that he that does fear does worship that which is feared, which is unquestionable when his fear is transcendent. He says the whole worship of God is frequently in Scripture expressed by this one word, fear. He quotes or references Matthew 4, chapter 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. And he says the Lord challenges this worship, this fear, as due to him alone. That is our God, which is our fear and dread. If you fear others more than him, you give that worship to them, which is due only to God. And this is plain idolatry, he says. Hence the fearful are reckoned amongst idolaters, and the same sentence denounced against them as against idolaters in the text, referencing Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. So here we see that our boldness is challenged, right? When we are afraid, you can see all in the book of Acts how the apostles were able to embrace the tragedies of being oppressed by those who did not appreciate and agree with their proclamation of the revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, what drove them to speak on those things anyway? Well, it was obviously the fact that they worshiped God and they feared God. They worshiped God more than anything else. And correspondingly, they feared God more than they feared anything else. They often would say this: we can't fear man. We don't fear man. We fear him who can destroy our body and our souls in hell, right? So fear. But then the eighth act of soul worship is hope. That which we make our hope, we worship as God. For hope is an act of worship. It says, when we make other things our hope, we give them the honor due only to God. It is a forsaking of the Lord, the fountain, and the advancing of broken cisterns into this place. Hereby worshiping them as God only should be worshiped. He references the papist here. He references a number of things, saints and all these different things. But the ultimate goal is he's trying to get us to see that not only an expectation, he says, of eternal glory, but outward happiness. When our principal hope is in friends, riches, and it is idolatry, for this is to worship them instead of God. And Job ranks it with that gross idolatry of worshiping the sun or the moon. When we hope in our friendships and our riches, he's saying that that's just as bad as worshiping the sun or the moon. Well, the ninth act of soul worship is idolatry. That which we most desire, we worship as our God. Now, here's the thing that's so funny. I have to just think about this because I have rarely sat down and heard or even said myself, to be honest with you, I want God. I want God. Now, I've done this before because, the psalmist actually tells. But what I'm saying is whenever you get into your day, right, and you're trying to accomplish something, nothing seems to be more desirable than the thing you're trying to accomplish. And it is so easy to forget that our desire is supposed to be solely fixed, primarily fixed on God. This is why he says that which is chiefly desired is the chief good in his account, whoso desires it. And what he counts his chief good, that he makes his God. Desire, he says, is an act of worship, that we must adore which we most desire. So, very interesting idea there, that whatever we most desire, we adore the most. And to be most desired is that worship, that honor, which is due only to God. He goes on to say to desire anything more or so much as the enjoyment of God is to idolize it, to prostrate the heart to it, and worship it as God only should be worshiped. It's very interesting. Because so many times we want things so badly that God is no longer desirable to us. And that thing has become our idol. It has become our God. We never think about it that way. We even pray for things. It's so interesting. It may be the reality that God does not give us what we ask for, because what we ask God for is something that would and will take the place of God if he grants it to us. It's so funny that we can actually ask God for something that will replace him, not knowing that it is actually, even our prayer to God is an act of idolatry. That's very scary, all right? Look at this. The 10th thing is delight. That which we most delight and rejoice in, that we worship as God. For transcendent delight is an act of worship due only to God. And this affection in its height and elevation is called glorifying. What do we glorify? I think about how we sometimes prop people up in churches and we acknowledge them, we love them. And of course, the Bible says he who, labors is worth double honor. We get that, no problem there. But listen, the issue that we run into is that when we begin to glorify something, right, to rejoice in our wisdom or strength or riches than in the Lord is idolatry, he says. To take more delight in relationships, wife, children, and outward comforts and accommodations than in God is to worship them as we ought only to worship God. To take more pleasure in any way of sin, uncleanness, and temperance, and earthly employments than in the holy ways of God, than in those spiritual and heavenly services wherein we may enjoy God, is idolatry. You see, to put our own pleasure over righteous living, he shows us, is idolatry. Those who take most pleasure in drinking or eating, making their bellies their God, and those who most delight in fulfilling their lust, be it worldly or an unclean or a revengeful lust, they exalt their lust above God, the God of heaven, and worship them. And this is, he says, is a heinous idolatry than to fall down and worship the sun or moon, angels or saints, because these are more worthy of honor than base lust. Nay, it is worse than to worship the devil, since Satan himself, being a creature, is not so vile as the lusts of men. You see that? So powerful words talking about what makes us rejoice. What do we find our joy and our delight in? When you read the psalmists, they talk about this. Our delight is in the will of the Lord, the word of the Lord even. So we see these things in the Psalms, but we never really think about how they are saying these things as a means of expressing their ultimate and greatest worship to God. The 11th thing he shows us is zeal, which is an interesting thing because he says that for which we are most zealous, we worship as God. Think about Paul being zealous over the law. He is worshiping the law while trying to worship God. It doesn't work that way. For such a zeal is an act of worship due only to God. Therefore, it is idolatrous to be more zealous for our own things than for the things of God, to be eager in our own cause and careless in the cause of God, to be more vehement for our own credit, interest, advantages than for truths, ways, honor of God, to be fervent in spirit in following our own business, promoting our designs, but lukewarm and indifferent in the service of God, to count it intolerable for ourselves to be reproached, slandered, reviled, but manifest no indignation when God is dishonored, his name, his Sabbath, his worship profane, his truths, ways, people reviled. This is idolatrous, for it shows something is clearer or dearer to us than God. And whatever that be, it is an idol. So you can understand whenever Jesus went and kicked over the tables, what was he doing there? Yes, he was embodying the actions of prophets before him, but what were they doing? Well, they were showing that we cannot be more zealous for other things than we are the things of God. We must say something, do something, respond to the dishonor that corrupts the nature of God as to direct our zeal towards the things of God and not towards something else. And it's so easy to confuse the two. Paul did that, but God approached him. Jesus came before him and set him on the right path so that he can appropriately and zealously worship God and not the law or the institution or even his own ambition. But the 12th act of soul idolatry is gratitude. It's gratitude. He shows us that that to which we are most grateful, that we worship as God. For gratitude is an act of worship. We worship that to which we are most thankful. We may be thankful to men. We may acknowledge the helplessness of means and instruments. But if we rest here and rise not, he says, higher in our thanks and acknowledgement, if the Lord be not remembered as him, without whom all these are nothing. It is idolatry. He says, thus you see, wherein this secret idolatry consists and how many ways we may be guilty of it, many more may be found, but I shall add just one more. Then we are guilty of this idolatry. He says, when our care and industry is more for other things than God, no man can serve two masters. That's the 13th thing. We cannot serve God and mammon, God and our lust too, because this service of ourselves of the Lord takes up that care, that industry, those endeavors, which the Lord must have of necessity if we will serve him as God. And when these are laid upon the world and our lust, we serve them as the Lord ought to be served, and so make them our gods. You see, he is saying here, your whole life, everything about you should be a pursuit of God, a quest for God, and the worship of God. This is what he's saying here. And this is powerful because, again, we might look at ourselves and say, man, I don't commit idolatry. I worship God. I raise my hands and but what's going on in here, right? It's just so easy to overlook what's going on in here. And this is why I really appreciate David Clarkson in this book. I often refer to it because it's just so powerful, but I think it is a reminder to continue doing the work of looking into your soul and your heart so that you can make sure there's nothing there sitting on the seat or in the seat that should only be reserved for God in our lives, whether that is our careers, our own ambition, our spouses, our children, family members, whatever. Ultimately, if we want to serve in all those things correctly, we must get the first thing done correctly, and that's worshiping God. So, friends, take a look at this article. This is just a piece of it. I'm going to leave a link in the description box below. You can check it out for yourself. I believe you'll be blessed by going further into this topic and this discourse. And so let me know your thoughts. Leave it in the comment box below, and we'll see what we can make of some conversation. But until next time, thank you for watching. Take care. God bless. And remember, live by the word.